This video was brought to you by the Daily Briefing. While the front lines in Ukraine have stabilised somewhat, over the last few weeks there's been more and more evidence that the Russians have essentially abandoned the city of Kherson, a regional capital with a pre-war population of 300,000 that they captured way back in March. This would be yet another bad result for the Russian army, which hasn't exactly covered itself in glory in this conflict. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the most recent developments on the battlefield, including the Russian withdrawal from Kherson, what might have motivated it, and how this will change the trajectory of the war going forward. If you want more updates from TLDR, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and also follow TLDR EU on Twitter, where we post regular updates. So before we get into what happened in Kherson, a quick look at other developments on the battlefield. Now, in our last Ukraine video, we claimed that the front lines have mostly stabilised, and while that's still true, there have nonetheless been a couple of notable developments. Perhaps the most significant event of recent days was the battle for Pavlivka, a small town in southern Donetsk which was retaken by Ukraine back in early July. This part of the front line has been relatively stable for most of the war, largely because the southeastern part of Donetsk was already under the control of the Donetsk People's Republic before Russia's invasion in February. This means both the DPR and Ukrainian forces have had years to set up defensive lines here, which means offensive advances are more difficult. Most of the fighting in Donetsk has actually occurred in northern Donetsk, where Russian forces have been trying to take Bakhmut on their way to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, the two large remaining Ukrainian holdouts in the oblast. The Russians' newfound interest in the area might have something to do with logistics. Since the attack on the Crimean Bridge, which still hasn't been fully repaired, Russia is currently struggling to supply Kherson and occupied territory in southeastern Ukraine. The main route at the moment is rail via Donetsk, but the Ukrainians are currently within firing range of the main rail route, which puts Russia's entire logistic arrangement in the south at risk. Anyway, the Russians have been bombarding Pavlivka with artillery since the Ukrainians recaptured it in July, and a couple of weeks ago they started to advance on the town. Originally, it looked like the Russian offensive was successful, and on October the 30th, Russian telegram channels claimed that the Russian forces had taken the town. Ukraine didn't deny the advance, which suggested the Russians really did retake the town. This advance was apparently spearheaded by Kazkad, an elite unit from the DPR. However, a few days later, a Ukrainian counter-offensive threatened to overwhelm the Russians, who duly called for backup. This is when things got really bad for the Russians. In response, Russian command sent in the 155th and 40th Naval Brigades, who suffered massive losses. On Sunday, after nearly a week of fighting, the 155th Brigade sent a letter to Russia's high command asking to retreat, claiming that they'd lost 300 troops and hundreds of vehicles in 4 days. This letter started doing the rounds on Russian military bloggers' Telegram accounts, and it's safe to say weren't happy. It's not entirely clear why things went so badly, but there's been some speculation that the brigades comprised newly conscript recruits, and by Monday Pavlivka was back under Ukrainian control. And if that wasn't bad enough news for the Russians, it also looks like they're going to give up Kherson city. Kherson is the regional capital of the Kherson Oblast, and it had a pre-war population of about 300,000. It was captured by the Russians in early March, and it's the largest city and only regional capital to fall during the war. However, over the past couple of months, Russia's position in Kherson has become increasingly untenable. There are a couple of reasons for this. First, Ukrainian forces have been making progress towards Kherson since early September, when a successful counter-offensive pushed Russian forces down the Dnipro. Second, logistics. As we mentioned a second ago, the attack on the Crimean Bridge has hindered Russia's logistical operation in the south. They're now more reliant on a rail that runs south from Donetsk. But, as Pavlivka demonstrated, Russian forces are unable to protect the rail line from Ukrainian artillery. This is bad enough news for Russian forces in the Kherson Oblast, but it's particularly terrible news for the 20,000 or so in Kherson city, because Kherson city lies on the west side of the Dnipro River. There are only 2 large crossings from the Russian-controlled territory on the east side of the Dnipro over to Russian forces in Kherson city on the west side. The Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson city and the Novokakhovka Dam, which lies just 35 kilometers downstream of the Russian front line at Mylove. As we've explained in previous videos, both of these have been bombarded by Ukrainian artillery and now have limited carrying capacity, and this has exacerbated Russia's pre-existing logistical difficulties in Kherson city. The Ukrainians have realised Russia's vulnerability here and have been building up their forces around Kherson in anticipation of another offensive. The Russians have apparently decided that they can't hold on to the city and have started retreating. Russian occupying authorities started evacuating the 60,000 or so civilians left in the city in mid-October, and over the weekend Putin himself encouraged civilians to leave the city. Last week it was reported that Russian troops themselves were leaving government buildings and checkpoints, and satellite imagery shows that Russian forces are setting up new defensive lines on the west bank of the Dnipro. Analysis of satellite images suggests that the Russians have set up 3 parallel lines of defence on the west side of the Dnipro, which really does suggest they're about to give up Kherson. This is obviously deeply embarrassing for Putin, not least because he apparently annexed Kherson just a few months ago. However, it sort of makes sense because Russia deployed its best troops to the west bank of the Dnipro, and they don't want to lose them. Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate claimed that the most capable Russian troops had been deployed to Kherson, including elite airborne forces known as the VDV and Russian Special Ops. If Russia's elite units were decimated, it would be terrible news not just for the Russian capacity, but also morale. Nonetheless, the loss of Kherson would be undeniably bad news for the Russians, and it won't go down well with the Russian nationalists or the Russian public. Russian nationalists have criticised Putin for not being aggressive enough, and the Russian public's enthusiasm for the war has waned since Putin's partial mobilization. According to the Levada Center, the most credible polling institute in Russia, while public support for the armed forces and Putin personally remains high, an increasing faction of the Russian public wants the Kremlin to open peace negotiations. The latest polling from October suggests that 57% of the public want to start peace negotiations, while just 36% want the war to continue. This is up from September, when 48% wanted peace, while 44% wanted the war to continue, and August, when 44% wanted peace, while 48% wanted the war to continue. All in all, things aren't looking good for Putin or the Kremlin. If you want to be updated with this story as it happens, subscribe to the channel for future videos and follow us on Twitter for more updates and news. Just search TLDR News EU. Or if you want to know what else is happening in the world, then check out the Daily Briefing. That's our show where we run you through the biggest news stories from around the world. Subscribe to that channel or listen in your favourite podcast app and make sure you're never left behind by the news cycle again.